This book has a few new concepts for the development of this religion called Scientology. Here, Hubbard goes into the tone scale, which is a basic personality test, a grid used to categorize people, and further develops the Theta concept, which is basically the soul, and how it relates to the material universe. I will get into some of the philosophy and discuss changes to the theory itself found in Dianetics. So stay tuned. Welcome to biblioCultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing all these things really helps the channel out, and I appreciate it. I will put below and on the side my socials, the way that you can support the channel with donations. All of that information will be on the screen. Also, for those who are new to the channel, I also put throughout the video references to my show notes, where I usually expand on a topic or give more information. So if you have the time, you can open the video description and look at my notes. Either you can do it at the end or whenever. Now, in this episode, I am going over The Science of Survival by L. Ron Hubbard. I will put my Amazon affiliate link in the description, where you can go and find this book among others that I've reviewed here. And when you buy it using that link, the channel gets a small percentage, and I really appreciate it. This edition is by Bridge Publications, 2001. And as some of you may know, I am going through a Scientology playlist. I tend to do these challenges for myself. If you look at my playlist, I have Islam, Christianity, occultism, etc. So I go through a variety of series. I do the same thing with Clive Barker when it comes to fiction and other authors. So ever since I reviewed Dianetics, I wanted to go into this rabbit hole in particular. And I'm going bit by bit through these books. I am trying to do almost every book that Hubbard ever published in a public fashion. He was very prolific. He even has a Guinness World Record, actually, in book publishing. So I may not hit every single book right away, but little by little, I'll probably get to them, or at least through the main books. And I think once you finish this series, you'll have a pretty good feel and knowledge of the basic tenets of said religion. My attempt here is to recommend the reading of those books. But if you come out of one of my reviews with a better understanding of the topics involved, then I think people will benefit even if they don't read the book. I'm trying to do these reviews in a way that I don't spoil them, but at the same time I give sufficient information that if you just leave with that, it should be at least a good primer on the topic. So in The Science of Survival, we find Hubbard's introduction of the Theta concept that eventually becomes the thetan, which would be the individual soul. He also presents for the first time the concept of the relationship between Theta, which would be that inner manifestation of consciousness or soul, and its relationship with MEST, which is matter, energy, space, and time, and how Theta forms actual organisms from MEST. So from a philosophical or theological point of view, what he's doing here is he is explaining the nature of reality, of existence, and how the Theta, the soul, manifests in material reality. So now we're dealing with ontology. In Dianetics, he actually didn't go into this. It was primarily a book about the inner dynamics of the mind and how it relates to events, actions, and how to cure these problems. But in this book, even though it's directly aimed at people who do auditing, which is his method of mental healing and spiritual advancement, he actually goes into more detail on these theological topics, which is actually what I wanted to get to from the very start. It is also in this book that he introduces the first Scientology triangle. The symbol of Scientology has a large S in the center and then two triangles kind of interlocked. The first triangle, it's called the arc triangle. Affinity, reality, communication. And to simplify, it's a very cool way of trying to explain human dynamics and how the theta exchanges with material reality. That without affinity to other beings or to existence itself, but in particular has to do with relationships, affects reality or the perception of reality, and at the same time, how communication affects reality and affinity. So his argument is that the moment you increase a shared reality, basically an acknowledgement or an affirmation of a shared reality, affinity increases and also does communication. And vice versa. If you increase communication, affinity and reality increase. And the same in the inverse. So as a method of understanding human relationships, it's actually a very practical and handy concept to tackle. He will eventually add another triangle, and we'll get there when we get there. I am already familiar with the second triangle, but I think it best to discuss it when he actually first brings it up in a book. Now, I would like to quote a few things from The Science of Survival because it is really packed with a lot of great information. And since I am a big fan of theology and philosophy, every time I find substantive, kind of deeper explorations of the problem of evil, the dynamics of eternality, soul, universe, divine being, etc., that's usually the stuff that I enjoy. Quote, "What we conceive to be reality is actually agreed upon perception of the physical universe. There is an endless philosophic wrangle as to whether or not our perceptions perceive anything, or whether or not our perceptions are merely an illusion themselves. True enough, the physical universe can be reduced down to a zero mathematically. Matter, energy, space, and time could be said to be the result of certain motions. The moment we go off into the by-road of wondering whether the physical universe is real or not, we come rapidly upon many philosophic imponderables. What we know as reality, however, is an agreed-upon conception of the physical universe in which we live." Now, that particular quote is fascinating because one of the biggest theological issues ever discussed has to do with the nature of existence and whether or not the things we observe are real. Now, without getting into the weeds of this, because it's legitimately a very complex topic, you do find some philosophical positions that argue that existence is illusory or that they are merely perception-based, and therefore they are constructs. Now, of course, when you say that something is a construct, you're saying it is metaphysical, actually. So, from that point of view, everything would be metaphysical, whether or not we agree or disagree on its full-blown material existence. So, to put it in another fashion, if everything that exists is objectively there, and it has an existence independent of our thoughts or our perceptions or our mutual agreements, that is a different philosophical position similar to traditional Christianity than the position that everything is illusion because we cannot perceive ever its real nature. And if we cannot perceive its essence, then we're never in contact with anything. Therefore, everything would be technically false in the sense that it is not what we think it is, which would be more the position of Advaita Vedanta, for example. But in the case of Hubbard, he seems to go the social route, meaning he's not negating the fact that MEST, matter, energy, space, and time exists. He is simply saying that what it is and how we define it is based primarily on agreement. The table is there, it exists because we agree it exists. The reason that two people can agree to it is because it has an independent existence outside of our own minds. But at the same time, how we describe it, how we define it has a lot to do with language and human agreement. So he is in a particularly hybrid position. Obviously, he's not the first one to do that. There are plenty of other systems that kind of go that route. But further on in the book, he actually goes a little bit more into the concept of reality. But I have to say that, at least in this book, he doesn't go too far in. So someone critical could say that if you just stand on this idea, you have a philosophical conundrum. But we'll see if in other books he actually expands upon this further. Now, I have an edition from 2001, and I have read online that supposedly there is a post-2001 edition of this book which modifies, changes Hubbard's words to tone down a bit the arguments and certain social perspectives that today would be politically incorrect, or at least seen as very harsh. So put it in the comments if that is true, if you have an edition that changes what I'm about to say, because I would be curious if it's true or if it's just online chatter. Basically, it deals with the second dynamic. Anyone that deviates from traditional male-female relationships with procreative potential are not only considered to be perverse, but he places them in a very low tone in his chart. And he compares them to murderers and thieves and backstabbers, etc. So supposedly they changed that and just put a general term that would imply any type of deviation, but without naming names, if you will. So some people would argue, well, they're not really changing anything. They're just modifying the terminology to be less explicit. I tend to have an issue with that because if you change a term, you're changing meaning. And Hubbard was a very particular writer. He was very specific with language, and so much so that in every book that I've ever seen by him, in the beginning of the book, he's particular about words, glossaries, dictionaries, that you should know the word. If you go through one and you don't know it, you should look it up and know what he's talking about. So a person that's like that writes in that way, if you modify his language, you're modifying his meaning and his intent. And I think that is a real problem that many religions face. Imagine that for political correctness, you will start modifying the Bible in Leviticus and many parts of the Bible to fit current sensibilities. I think this would be a violation of a basic principle of ethics and truthfulness. Hubbard utilizes the tone scale not only for auditing, but he uses the tone scale to identify human beings and how we should relate to them and how even society should manage people in that category. So he has a scale of 1 to 4, and anyone in a 2 or below is considered to be basically insane, and therefore people below that 2 level are dangerous to society. And this would be the controversial aspect of it, because not only pointing out who is below a 2, most religions would agree that certain behaviors that violate basic principles of family would fall into a low tone. But because everyone's so sensitive these days, comparing people in these low tones to other low tone behavior will be controversial. Now, I'm not afraid of controversy. I don't really care. I'm about books and the knowledge in the books, and I'll discuss them the way they are. But if someone is so afraid of their own religious texts that they have to modify them, I think that could be seen as a problem. Either a religion is about ideas irrespective of popularity, or it's about popularity irrespective of the ideas. And with that, let me go to another quote that I think is relevant. One might postulate 2 more realities. The first is that of the Supreme Being. No culture in history of the world, save the thoroughly depraved and expiring ones, has failed to affirm the existence of a Supreme Being. It is an empirical observation that men without a strong and lasting faith in a Supreme Being are less capable, less ethical, and less valuable to themselves and society. A government wishing to deprave its people to the point where they will accept the most perfidious and rotten acts abolishes first the concept of God, and in the wake of that destroys the family with free love, the intellectual with police-enforced idiocies, and so reduces a whole population to an estate somewhat below that of a dog. A man without an abiding faith is, by observation alone, more of a thing than a man. Now, that quote is amazing because it's what I would call traditionalist And I would be hard-pressed to find a Catholic, a Muslim, a traditional Buddhist, a traditionalist Hindu that would disagree with that quote. So even though they would throw very strong aspersions against Scientology and Hubbard in particular, I don't see how they could disagree with that statement. So that to me has been the most interesting aspect of this journey of me going through this religion in particular, is that when it comes to certain social values and certain theological perspectives, at least, there is quite a similarity. And that quote would be a good example of that. Now, what the Supreme Being is a different question. Because although Hubbard talks about the Supreme Being, he doesn't really attempt to define him per se. So I'm curious to see where he takes the notion of the Supreme Being, because throughout these two books, he speaks on the idea of the Supreme Being, but it's usually as a conceptual force, as a basis, as a foundation, but not necessarily as a well-defined entity. Unlike other ideas in Scientology, like the Theta, which is actually defined, and MEST, and all these other concepts like the 8 dynamics, etc. His position on abortion, for example, is very traditional because he sees it as a violation of the second dynamic, the dynamic of procreation. So that would be another point of common ground that, to me, it's just so fascinating to find in a religion that many people consider to be sci-fi or highly weird and exotic. But in most of the main issues, they're not exotic at all. They're very straightforward, conservative, and traditional. And for example, in that very topic of the second dynamics of family, etc., here's another quote. "The whole future of the race depends upon its attitude towards children. In a race which specializes in women for menial purposes, or which believes that the contest of the sexes in the spheres of business, action, and politics is a worthier endeavor than the creation of tomorrow's generation, is a race which is dying. We have in the woman who is an ambitious rival of the man in his own activities, a woman who is neglecting the most important mission she may have. A society which looks down upon this mission, and in which women are taught anything but the management of a family, the care of men, and the creation of the future generation, is a society which is on its way out." Again, I don't see any person of a traditional religious background who would disagree with that statement, which again points to the fact that although it seems to be a futuristic type of religion, and many people would think it's kind of new agey, it's actually the opposite. It has almost, in every aspect that I've studied so far, it is not new agey at all. It contains very clear, kind of straightforward positions that I would put closer to things like social Darwinism and traditional Christianity or traditional Islamic views on certain things than most people would imagine. Although again, I think he is primarily deriving these concepts not from straight up normative classic religion. I think he is deriving it more from Darwinian and Nietzschean concepts. Like I mentioned in my previous video, Hubbard did hang out with Jack Parsons and was somewhat influenced by a particular form of occultism that had many branches, and a lot of these branches were actually quite traditional. You have people like Julius Evola and others who go through the same material but come to the conclusion that the modern world is perverse and has fallen because it has torn away from a natural life of tribe, nation, family, etc. So I see Hubbard so far as leaning more towards that direction and not so much in the classical cultic, laissez-faire, almost anarchic viewpoint. And because he has an idea called social Dianetics in which he places people in that scale, 0 to 4, 0 being dead and 4 being the optimum, the clear. And he even says that people below a 2 should have no civil rights whatsoever because they're insane. That places him squarely in a very familiar territory when it comes to those thinkers that I just mentioned. So very fascinating. I would say it's probably the most controversial aspect of Hubbard that most people don't know about, which is the way that you use the tone scale for social purposes. And it makes sense, like I've spoken in different reviews here. If you believe in actual religion and you believe its methods and system, it makes sense that you want society to reflect it. This is the most natural thing to believe. So obviously, if you believe the tone scale is the correct way of understanding human beings, and you become convinced that those below a certain point are literally crazy, then why would you want them to run society, for example, to become president, to be in the Senate or the legislature? I mean, it's obvious that if that's your belief, it would be ridiculous to not see the world in that fashion. The same thing goes for Muslims and Christians. So I tend to be very tolerant of these perspectives because it makes sense in the context. If you believe it, it makes sense you want it to be reflected in reality. Another aspect that I found interesting is the way he describes death, because since he states that Theta, which is the soul, which is this independent eternal energy basically, comes into contact with the material world and controls it and concocts, generates, creates, however you want to call it, organisms into which the Theta can control, inhabit, and then control MEST and progress, generate, procreate, survive, etc. If the Theta is not very efficient or powerful enough to achieve this goal, then death occurs because there is a divorce, a separation between MEST and Theta. They cannot be in harmony anymore. So it's a very fascinating explanation of the nature of death, of existence, etc. Theologically, he even discusses oneness, because it seems to me so far that he is a straight dualist, very similar to Zoroastrian theological perspectives. That the oneness idea is absurd from his perspective, that you cannot have one without the contrast, that we will be incapable to even comprehend oneness because everything is always in a contrast. And therefore, at the end of it all, it's always a duality. We know God because we know the opposite of God. We know good because we know evil. So therefore, from his point of view, a duality is the only way to comprehend existence, which places the Theta universe and the MEST universe. Now you have two universes. One would be the soul, the Shakti, the spiritual energy, and then you have the material energy, which is chaotic and in flux, changing, etc. And then you have the union of these two forces and a balancing of these two forces. So that's classic dualism. That seems to be his position, at least so far. This book has so much information that no matter how much I speak on it, I cannot spoil it because it really needs to be read to be understood. But before I close the review, I do want to mention the elements that I found fascinating that he changed from the previous book, because it's always good to see an evolution, a change, however you want to call it, of previous ideas and how they modify in later works. So a major change from the prior book, Dianetics, is the notion that you shouldn't audit anyone below a 3.5, which is quite high in the scale actually. So even though in Dianetics the argument was made that auditing could never hurt anyone psychologically or physically by just auditing people, and if you want to know about that, just go and watch the Dianetics review. Here he's arguing that after further research that you shouldn't audit people below 3.5. And again, that's a high scale, so that means most people should not be audited because he thinks it could cause harm. And because this book is about the tone scale, he changes the philosophy a little bit to argue that your job as an auditor should be to elevate the tone scale on the person, not necessarily audit them for engrams, which is something you should only do when the person has been already pretty high in the scale and he can take the process of going and digging into an engram. So that's a real change, at least in the praxis of the religion. So it caught my attention. Another change is that he adds elements that were not there before. So before, he believed that human beings were divided into a duality, a reactive mind and an analytical mind. The reactive mind would be the unconscious. And it's reactive because it's like an animal. It reacts to things. Its only purpose is survival, but has no analytical capacity. The analytical mind is the thinking mind, the awakened mind. But he also mentions in this book the aesthetic mind, which is almost the artistic mind. And he argues that there's plenty of other minds that could be positive, but that's a change. so I have to mention it. So all in all, it's actually a very entertaining book, a very thought-provoking book. I actually enjoyed it very much. There are certain areas there that are a little slower to read because they're very technical about auditing and about how the human mind deals with that, and that could be a bit dry, but once he gets into the philosophical things, which happens throughout the book, so it's not like he waits to a certain point and then talks about philosophy. It's actually spread through the entire work. It is a really interesting philosophical system and a very interesting development of a school of psychiatry. And like Jungianism and others, which are also basically quasi-religions, Hubbard at least has the foresight and the guts to just go straight up and call it a religion. And it does have all the characteristics of a basic religion, because I know some people would argue that it isn't somehow, although usually people that say these things are not familiar with the actual interior positions of a religion. One religion is going to accuse another religion, especially if it's small or new, of not qualifying for the term religion. And this is very arbitrary, but it's very common. From my point of view, a religion, as long as it complies with some very important elements, falls into the category. Whether I like it or not, it falls into it. Hopefully you can derive some benefit from the review. Please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. Doing these things really helps, sharing it with a friend, liking it, etc. So thank you for being with me. See you next time.